I don't think I've ever properly spoken about this on the channel at length, but I love Halo. For years, I've been obsessed with the games themselves, the lore, and the community. I have a stack of comics here on my shelf that I've read cover to cover more times than I can count. When I was younger, I had a huge poster of Master Chief in my room. I don't think I can possibly stress enough how many hours I've spent watching lore breakdowns on the various alien factions in the universe's rich history. All this is to say, I love Halo, but that hasn't really been easy for the last couple of years. Just to clarify, even though I've been into the franchise for many years, I'm still a newer fan and haven't been around since the golden age of CE, Halo 2, and Halo 3 and Reach. My first game was Halo 4, even though Halo 5 was already out. Just for a bit of background, in case you've been living under a rock, in the 2000s there are a few cultural things that reigned supreme. And some of those things were early Xbox Live, namely Halo and COD, early social medias like Facebook and MySpace, and pop punk. Among those early Xbox Live games, though, nothing was even close to the absolute cultural monolith that was Halo. This was a time when Halo was so influential that you literally would be less likely to buy a PlayStation because it meant you couldn't play with your friends because they all had an Xbox and were playing Halo. For literally years after the release of Halo 3, if you went to someone's house and they had an Xbox, chances are Halo 3 would be in the disk drive. So, if Halo was this massive 15 years ago, what happened? After Halo 3, which was the end of the original Halo trilogy, right at the peak of the franchise's popularity, Bungie, the original creators, decided that they wanted to move on to better things. As part of their contract with Microsoft, they were required to make two more Halo games before they were fully let go. For the first of the two required games, they decided to cheat a bit by stretching out what was originally going to be a small scale Halo 3 DLC into a full scale game. This was Halo 3 ODST, which was a well received and financially successful game in its own right, but not quite the smash hit money printer that Microsoft had gotten used to with the Halo franchise. So, for the final ever Bungie Halo game, Halo Reach, they decided to pull out all the stops to give the franchise a perfect send off. But players started to notice something. See, around this time, there was another game that you may or may not have heard of that was starting to become quite popular. You know, you might not have heard of it. It was called something like, I don't know, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Up until the release of Modern Warfare 2, Halo had been the trendsetter in the gaming industry. Its physics, weapons, mechanics, graphics, art style, and story were all the absolute gold standard that every studio wanted a piece of. Every studio in the world wanted their own Halo. But something really strange started to happen in Halo Reach. It no longer really felt like classic Halo. Things like the armor abilities, the introduction of sprinting, the overall change of the art style, and other general gameplay changes made it feel like Halo was no longer setting trends, it was copying a more popular game and trying to capture some of COD's success. Halo Reach was still a massive critical and even bigger commercial success, and brought forward great features like ODST's Wave Survival Mode Firefight and a vastly expanded version of Halo 3's Forge, and the game is now remembered as a fan favourite in the franchise. The reception was a bit more mixed than the previous entries at the time, though. But other than that, the game's player population was still huge, and it still printed money for Microsoft, with a player population of almost a million a year after launch. After that, Bungie left a heartfelt message at the end of the campaign, handed the rights of the franchise to Microsoft, and moved on to develop Destiny. Immediately after, Microsoft decided to form an entire studio to continue to move Halo forward. They appointed Bonnie Ross, originally the head of Microsoft Games, as studio head, and began to build a studio of industry veterans to develop the next game in the franchise. The teaser for Halo 4 was shown at E3 in 2011, and was followed by Halo's usual mass marketing blitz. The game itself released in 2012 and was a bit of a mixed bag to say the least. Things just felt different. Remember the early signs that were starting to show up in Halo Reach of the franchise starting to follow what was popular instead of innovating? That's now about 10 times worse. Kill streaks, loadouts, perks, even a literal clone of COD's Spec Ops. Halo 4 tried to clone all of it, and ended up just chipping away at the core feeling of Halo. The overall mood is somehow just different too. The Covenant, the franchise's primary antagonists, now look completely different and horrible. Human Marines that used to look like grounded, realistic soldiers now look like literal toys, and Spartans just look like knockoff plastic versions of Iron Man. This trend of eroding what made Halo unique continued into Halo 5, leaving the franchise that just a few years ago ruled the world in an absolutely shameful state. At this point, in the franchise's darkest hour, a teaser was released. This teaser showed us some interesting things. This teased the return of the classic art style, a more familiar setting, the classic soundtrack, the original armor design, and just generally felt a lot more like what we've come to expect and love from classic Halo. There were a few missteps in the marketing and run up to Halo Infinite's launch, mainly in the disastrous gameplay reveal with a few particularly memeable frames, but when the full launch came around, after several delays to get the game into a reasonable state, reception was extremely positive. 343 had somehow managed to strike a perfect balance between the feel and physics of classic Halo, and the modern edge that the game needed to keep up with its competitors. The campaign, while not quite as epic as Halo 3, was a smaller story that felt like a new beginning for the franchise and its story, that completely jettisoned the messy plot of Halo 4 and 5. There was just one problem: there wasn't that much content. Even though the game sold massively well in the first while with enormous player numbers early on, those players didn't really stick around for too long when they realized that even though Infinite's core gameplay was amazing, there just wasn't enough to keep the average player interested. The game didn't outright flop, it more just sort of fizzled out over time. 343 spent the next year or so getting features like Forge and Split Screen that were promised at launch functioning, and eventually completely canned the season model in favor of smaller cosmetic updates. This is the point where most of the mainstream audience had completely checked out of modern Halo. For a while afterwards, 343 were in damage control mode, trying desperately to get the game into some kind of acceptable state, with company-wide layoffs at Microsoft hitting the studio fairly hard. So after all this, what's actually come out the other end? Here's the thing: I actually really like Halo Infinite. Since the majority of the mainstream audience sadly checked out, the game's really improved. Over the last year, some hotly anticipated modes like Firefight and Infection were added, and most of the major issues from the incomplete launch version have been fixed. It even had a thriving esports scene that's sadly due to end next year, I think, with huge attendances for live events and big investments into teams. The other thing is Forge and its community. This game's Forge mode is absolutely incredible and has gone beyond just a building and editing mode to basically a lighter version of the Slipspace engine that 343 used to actually build the game. Obviously, creations are some of the most impressive we've ever seen in a Halo game to date, and Forge creators are literally carrying the game's player base and content with new maps and modes. I'm not going to talk too much about Forge because just from the very short amount of time I've spent in it, I can tell that Infinite's Forge is well beyond my intelligence level. It really does feel like a complete Halo game at this point, and might honestly be some of the best gameplay Halo's ever had, and definitely the best in the modern era. This game's movement loop is another of my favourite things about it. In the original trilogy, Halo's player movement system was about as simple as it got for a 3D game. You could walk in all directions, jump, and crouch. That was it. The 343 games tried to modernise this movement loop by adding a sprint in Halo 4 that, in my opinion, just felt kind of weird, like sliding around on ice or something. Halo 5 went even further by adding ground slam, hover thrusters, jetpacks, and all kinds of special movement abilities. Halo Infinite still included a sprint, but heavily nerfed to the point of being basically walking, a tactical slide, and a hugely well received fan favourite grappling hook. All this adds up to a movement loop that feels very much like Halo, but with more dimensions than the classic games, and allows for some fairly amazing trick shots. I really believe that if Infinite launched in the state it's in now, it would be up there as one of the biggest and best games in the world. If you checked out of Halo Infinite after launch or have never played it before, I'd highly recommend you check out the free multiplayer. The game finally seems to be in a stable state of steady content releases. A couple of months ago, we got an announcement that 343 is completely changing its name and restructuring its leadership and how it intended to handle the franchise moving forward, saying that they were developing multiple new projects, likely both mainline and spin offs. This is exactly what the franchise needs at the moment. And the thing is, since then, we've got more actual content for the game than the entire time that 343 was in control. We've got 4 new weapons, the return of a scaled down live surface narrative, new maps, better balancing, and even the fan favourite air vehicle, the Falcon. Even though just a couple of months ago most fans were starting to say that Halo Infinite support was likely starting to wind down as 343, sorry, Halo Studios, was shifting its workforce to whatever the next big game in the franchise was. It seemed like the studio really are trying to get Halo Infinite into a better state. Sadly, the only people who care are the world's most hardcore Halo fans, and player populations are still absolutely through the floor. But if we're to trust what Halo Studios has to say recently, there's something big on the horizon. If that's already been teased in a video at last year's Halo World Cup, that might mean a remake of the original Halo CE, it might mean Halo 7, it might mean some kind of spin off, who knows? And it's getting revealed in just a few months at this year's Worlds, likely with some kind of full gameplay reveal next year, as hinted at by this fairly cryptic statement from Phil Spencer at this year's Xbox Games Showcase.
I'm excited to share that players will get to celebrate 25 years of Xbox with a new Fable, the next Forza, Gears of War E-Day, and the return of a classic that's been with us since the beginning.
So in short, if we're to again believe what's being sold to us, it's finally starting to look like the future actually might be bright for Halo. I just hope that we haven't got another Halo Infinite to look forward to, but until more news comes out, I'm going to be cautiously optimistic. Thanks for watching. This is another really long one. I actually think it might be my longest script ever. So if you're enjoying this gaming related content, please let me know because I've really been enjoying making it. Other than that, please consider subscribing as I do put a huge amount of effort into these videos, and I'll see you in the next one.